Hi, everybody. Good afternoon. Thank you all so much for joining us today. Sid mentioned you might have seen me with Texas Impact or on the Texas Border Collaboration Network webinar. But once again, if you have not, my name is Sarah Cruz. I'm the policy specialist, and we'll also be coordinating the Courts and Ports program when it is hopefully up and running again. So I'm going to go ahead and get started with our presentation. I'm going to go over a little bit of background and context on immigration and topics that we're going to be focusing on today, and then provide you all a little bit of updates and maybe touch on a few current policies, and then briefly tell you what you can do to help advocate for those in your community and throughout Texas and the US. So I'm going to go ahead and get started. And with just a quick overview, so what is immigration, asylum, updates on the migrant protection protocols, the border, detention, briefly going over militarization of the border, and lastly, what can you do? So immigration, right? It's a one word with potentially a lot of meanings. So it could, someone mentions the word immigration, they could literally just be talking about the movement of, people moving to the US. But it could also bring a lot of different things to mind because it does span a wide range of topics and issues. If someone were to come to me and say, what do you know about immigration? I wouldn't really know where to start because I'm kind of wondering, well, what are they thinking? Are they talking about visas? Are they talking about the border and border security, the agencies that work within immigration like ICE and Border Patrol? Or maybe they're just thinking of immigration within two different buckets of legal immigration or illegal immigration. So legal immigration, people who have valid documents to enter the US, like a visa, or illegal immigration, those who don't have valid documents or legal documents to come into the US, so they come unlawfully or unauthorized. Also, just as a personal preference, I really don't like to use the term illegal when describing somebody, just as I don't like to use the word alien. So for this presentation, you'll probably hear me say unlawfully or unauthorized. But in conclusion, when talking about immigration, you can be talking about a lot of different subjects. But for today and for the sake of this presentation, we're going to be focusing on one group of the immigrant community, and that is the people who come to the US to seek protection. But first, I just want to go over, so why do people come to the US? People come to the US permanently or temporarily for a number of reasons. There's about an infinite number of visa categories, and honestly, way more than I thought that there were. But here are just a few different examples of why people might come to the US. So they might come for work, to study, for family under a family-based sponsorship protection, but we're going to go on into more detail on that. Or they could be here for another reason, for business, or they're here as a tourist to see New York or the Grand Canyon. But as I mentioned, we're going to be focusing on the group who come to the US to seek protection. And so seeking protection, you can be granted protection in the US in a number of ways. So you can come through the refugee resettlement process, through the asylum process, or as a TPS holder, you're already in the US, but you can be granted a TPS holder if your country is designated as TPS. So the Secretary of Homeland Security could designate your country as TPS if it meet certain conditions, if there is a conflict, a disaster like a hurricane or an earthquake, or an epidemic, or other extraordinary and temporary conditions that prevent you from returning to your country safely. So some examples of countries that are currently designated as TPS are Haiti, South Sudan, Yemen, and Syria. There's also withholding of removal, which is, withholding of removal is a little weird. So it's a lot easier to remove, and there's very little to no benefits. And there's also no pathway to citizenship, unlike coming as if you were a refugee or asylum seeker. And lastly, there's the Convention Against Torture, and you can be granted relief withholding of removal under CAT or a deferral of removal under CAT. And so the Convention Against Torture is protection protection under the Convention Against Torture is the U.S. obligation under Article 3 of the UN Convention Against Torture. And under this international agreement, the U.S. agreed to not expel, return, or extradite people to another country where they would be tortured. Okay, and so before I move on, I know this is a good amount of background, but I just wanted to address something because it's a question that I see very often and was even a question that I saw in some of my immigration policy classes. And that is, what is the difference between a refugee and asylum seeker? What is the difference between, being granted protection? So the difference is very mainly in the processing. To be admitted as a refugee, that process begins outside of the U.S., while coming to the U.S., being admitted as an asylum seeker, you're either already in the U.S. or present yourself at a port of entry, or you're apprehended and say that you have a fear of returning to your country. For refugees, there is a limit on the number that can be admitted each fiscal year. So that's known as the Refugee Ceiling. The Refugee Ceiling for fiscal year 2021 is 15,000. That was set by the Trump administration, and that was the lowest it has ever been. For asylum, there is no limit to the number of asylum seekers that can be admitted each fiscal year. But the one similarity that they both do share is that you must meet the definition of a refugee to be admitted as an asylum seeker and as a refugee. And that definition is someone who is outside of their country or country of last habitual residence, and they're unable or unwilling to return because of a fear of being persecuted on one of 5 grounds. So that's race, religion, nationality, membership of a particular social group, or your political opinion. And lastly, bear with me just a little bit more context. So to apply for asylum, there's 2 different ways that it can be done. So there's the affirmative asylum process and the defensive asylum process. So with affirmative asylum, you must be currently present in the US, and you must not be in removal proceedings and have applied within 1 year of your arrival. And then there is the defensive asylum process. So you are apprehended at a port of entry or in the US and then are placed into removal proceedings. And so this is typically the process that we see when people arrive to the border and they don't have any valid documents to be admitted lawfully. And so then they're placed into removal proceedings and they move forward with their asylum claim in the defensive process. But before I move forward, I just really want to stress something, that asylum is a basic right. Everybody has a basic human right to protection, and under international and domestic law, the US does have an obligation to provide that protection. Okay, and so I just wanted to show some of the affirmative asylum cases for fiscal year 2017, 2019. So these are the people that were already in the US and applied within 1 year of their arrival. So some countries: Venezuela, Guatemala, China, El Salvador. And then the defensive asylum cases. So these are likely people who arrived at the border or between a port of entry. And so then, now for the update on the Migrant Protection Protocol, so MPP. So MPP was one of the most controversial, which rightfully so, and the most problematic policies that was enacted by the most recent administration. It was also known as the Remain in Mexico policy because, calling it the Migrant Protection Protocols was very much inaccurate to what it did for asylum seekers. So this policy returned non-Mexican nationals to Mexico to wait for their immigration proceedings, and it was implemented at 7 different ports of entry. As a result, more than 68,000 people were returned to Mexico under this policy, that's including children, and there was more than 1,500 documented cases of attacks on asylum seekers. And so 1,500 cases does not equal to the amount of victims. I reviewed about 180 different cases, and there were about 500 victims within just a very small number of the cases. So there's probably a lot more. And I do also want to stress that the 1,500 documented cases are the ones that were reported. And there can be a number of others that actually occurred. Another result of the policy was that asylum seekers had extremely limited access to legal representation. So, you're stuck in Mexico and it becomes very difficult to find legal representation in the US. And, for those who did, um, oftentimes it was difficult to communicate with your attorney. And then it was also dangerous. People were waiting in border cities in Mexico. And I remember when we had our Courts and Ports intensive, I think in 2019, someone shared a recording of their client in Mexico, and you could hear gunshots in the background. So, it was understandable why some attorneys wouldn't want to travel into Mexico. Lastly, another result, the pictures you see on the slide here, that's from the Matamoros Camp. Some of you may have actually seen this in person if you went on a Courts and Ports trip during 2019. But in the Matamoros Camp, I know it transitioned a little bit to where the global response team was there. But when it first started, people were living in really poor conditions because they weren't able to move forward in the asylum process the way that it was supposed to work. So they had little access to basic necessities. And here are the different ports of entry, or the different cities where people were returned when they went back to Mexico. So Tijuana, Mexicali, Nogales, Ciudad Juarez, Piedras Negras, Nuevo Laredo, and Matamoros. And so one of the things that always gets me about MPP is, how did this happen and how was this okay? So it wasn't okay, but the prior administration was able to find legal justification under the Immigration and Nationality Act. So within the Immigration and Nationality Act, it says that, and it's in a very specific section, that the US is able to return certain applicants for admission to the contiguous country, so the country that we share a border with, from which they are arriving on land, whether or not at a designated port of entry, pending removal proceedings under Section 240 of the Immigration and Nationality Act. And so the rationale for the previous administration was that they implemented this unprecedented action to address the humanitarian and security crisis at the border, and that this humanitarian approach, so MPP, would help end the exploitation of generous immigration laws and would be a methodical, common sense approach to help address the crisis at the border. So what is happening with MPP right now? It's slowly being rolled back. As someone who has been waiting to see changes and has been, and it feels like forever, and I know some of you may feel the same way, it's easy to get frustrated and see how it's not all just lifted at once. But we have to remember that these changes are gradual, and there's a lot of different moving parts, and there's different actors that are involved in this. So on January 21st, DHS announced the suspension of additional enrollments in MPP, indicating that this policy would be coming to an end. Shortly after, on February 11th, they announced the process to address those with active MPP cases. I do want to say that DHS, the Biden administration said that the announcement should not be interpreted as an opening for people to migrate to the US, and that they would continue to enforce immigration law and border security measures. And so then on February 19th, processing begins at the San Isidro port of entry, and the UN Conecta registration portal also becomes active. And then shortly after, on February 25th, processing begins in Matamoros, and then the following day, processing begins at the Paso del Norte port of entry. So according to DHS, there are about 25,000 active MPP cases, but that's something that I want to point out, because even though there are 25,000 active cases, nearly 70,000 people were sent back under the policy. So many of them had their cases already heard, or they were even ordered removal under, because they didn't attend their court hearing. But that's something to remember, because MPP was designed for things like this. People were forced to try and get to the border at ridiculous times. So at 3, 4 in the morning, in the dark, in dangerous Mexican cities where they are vulnerable. So people were often kidnapped on their way to court. And just, I mean, we just have to remember that this policy was a means of deterrence, and unfortunately, it was successful in many cases. And so here's some of the groups that are actually helping with the processing. So in Mexico, the UNHCR is there, IOM, the International Organization for Migration, UNICEF, the Global Response Management Team, and Resource Center Matamoros. In the US, there's the Ingrid Diaz and Abuelas of the RGV, Team Brownsville, and there's volunteer attorneys that are providing legal advice at the bus station where people are being processed while they're in the US to wait so that they can get on the bus to their destination. These are the different groups that are for sure in Brownsville. It varies by port of entry, but with the different groups who might be on the US side. But UNHCR is for sure at all different ports of entry, and so is IOM. They're handling the logistics of moving people across the border and conducting COVID testing. And so, like I mentioned, processing does work differently at each port of entry. So, for example, in Tijuana, processing occurs the day before, and then people are transported the next day. But in Juarez, people are processed the same day. The UNHCR has told me that there is more than 20 people who have registered on the website. About half of them are eligible, and about half of them are also in Juarez. So that port of entry is likely to be a priority and be really busy. Also, COVID testing is conducted in Mexico, but the procedures for moving forward also vary by port of entry. So if you are at the San Isidro port, so in California, and if you enter, asylum seekers have to quarantine for 7 days. But here in Matamoros, if you have a negative test, you're able to move forward to your destination. If you do have a COVID positive test, then you are required to quarantine in Mexico and then take another test, and then you can be admitted and allowed to go to your destination. Okay, and so now I wanted to move on to the border a little bit more broadly. I know MPP cases are being processed, but yet the border remains closed. DHS announced that it would be closed to non-essential travel until March 2021. So the closure first happened about a year ago and was extended continuously under the Trump administration, and the Biden administration has not indicated when they would be lifting that emergency measure. So how is it closed? Under Title 42 of the U.S. Code, the U.S. is able to implement the suspension of entry of persons because it creates a serious danger of the introduction of a disease, so in this case, the coronavirus, into the U.S. This was something that public health experts explicitly said. They explicitly argued against this, saying that we can both serve the public health and meet our obligations to provide protection. The UNHCR also, around the same time, said that governments do have every right to limit travel and implement different restrictions, but that it should be a way that is compatible with international refugee protection and should not result in the closure of avenues to asylum or force people back to situations where they would be in danger. Unfortunately, that guidance was not followed. And the thing is about the border, the closure is really difficult because, you know, it's not supposed to be open to non-essential travel. How much vetting goes into that, I'm not 100% sure. I haven't been to Mexico in a while, but you are able to cross. And according to Human Rights First data that they reviewed, there was more than 40 million pedestrian and border pedestrian and vehicles that crossed between April and September of 2020. So it's a weird closure. Like I said, the Biden administration has not indicated when they would reopen the border, but they said that, you know, people need to wait, that it takes time to rebuild a system that was this dismantled, and that if families come, they are obligated into the service of public health to implement those restrictions and, you know, send people back to Mexico. And that they're saying, we're not saying don't come, we are saying don't come right now, that, there's still a lot of work that needs to be done. And so I do want to point your attention to the monthly enforcement encounters. These are Title 42 expulsions during fiscal year 2021. So it is a significant amount of, people that are being expelled under this. Children for a period of time were also being expelled under Title 42, but that was blocked by a judge in November 2020. Okay. So on a related note, kind of some good news, kind of good and bad. So the parents of 105 children were recently found. So there were about 611 children who still were separated from their parents, and they were separated during the zero tolerance policy. So 105 children, the parents of 105 children have been found. 506 still have yet to be reunited with their family. The parents of 322 are believed to have been deported, so that's going to take some work and some cooperation between the task force and different governments. So the governments of El Salvador, Guatemala, Honduras, and they'll also be working with different NGOs to try and locate those parents so they can be reunited. And I think the intent is to have them reunited in the US. So how did the border get militarized? How did we get here? So militarization of the border, increased border security has been happening for decades now. I think it goes back even further than 1924, but I figured we can start there. So I mean, it happened under the Obama administration, it happened under the Bush administration. I mean, there was the Secure Fence Act. Obama signed the Southwest Border Security Bill, which added 600 million to the Border Patrol. And then we saw a lot of different measures implemented under the Trump administration. But I mean, this has been happening for years. Even since 2015, funding for CBP, for Customs and Border Protection and ICE has increased by almost $9 billion. And for fiscal year 2020, DHS budget for immigration enforcement, reached an all-time high of $26 billion. And the total funding just for immigration enforcement surpasses the total funding for all other law enforcement agencies. So this is a big budget that DHS has for not only border security, but for immigration enforcement. I did not know that had transition. So before I get to our detention update, I also wanted to give a little bit of background on detention as well. So in the first place, why are people in detention? They could be in detention for mandatory detention. They have certain criminal records, which is typically an aggravated felony. Some immigration advocates do have a problem with this, similarly with the ICE enforcement priorities, because aggravated felonies can vary through by state. So yeah, there's that with mandatory detention and ICE enforcement priorities. Someone can be in detention because they're in removal proceedings and they could pose a flight risk, or they've missed a hearing. So when we see families put in detention, it's because they arrive at the border and don't have the legal documents to enter legally. And then they're placed into removal proceedings and then placed into detention. You can be released from detention on bond or parole. Bond is typically, the minimum is set at $1,500. So this is very much not the easiest payment to make if you've just entered the US and you had to flee your country. And so there are different types of facilities that an individual can be placed in when they're detained. So something that I do want to point your attention to is the fact that it says local governments on a few of these. So this very much means that local governments are in relationships and contracts between, with ICE. So whenever you're thinking about advocating, also make sure that you are contacting your local officials, because they are some of the ones that are making contracts with ICE. Okay, so ICE currently operates only 3 family detention centers. 2 of them are in Texas and another one is located in Pennsylvania. The South Texas Family Residential Center in Dilley can house up to or detain about 2,400 people. Karnes can detain about 800, and Berks can detain about 100. And I think 96 is a very more specific number, but in total, this is more than 3,000 people that can be detained in the family detention centers. Okay. So I wanted to share ICE enforcement priorities for a reason. So those 3 priorities, they were listed in this Pekoski memo that was released on January 20th. It falls under national security, border security, and public safety. So the reason that I'm sharing this with you is just as I don't like to use the word illegal or alien when I refer to people, I don't like to use this phrase, but catch and release, you might have heard of that under the Obama administration, but basically what's happening is families are being apprehended at the border and then released into the interior of the US to wait for their immigration proceedings. And so I think, so one thing that has been mentioned by the Biden administration is that they're trying to end long-term family detention. So that could be a result of this. But also in that Pekoski memo, it was stated that due to limited resources, ICE has always prioritized and necessarily must prioritize certain enforcement and removal actions over others. So this could be a symbolic thing. This could just be something that the Biden administration is doing because they want to move away from long-term family detention. I mean, I would prefer that people are, released instead of being put into detention. So I guess kind of good news. So something else that I want to emphasize about detention is that in addition to being inhumane and, we're treating people who are seeking protection like criminals after they have already likely experienced a significant amount of trauma, either in their home country or on their journey to the US, we're subjecting them to even more by placing them in detention. And that detention is extremely expensive. It's about $480 to detain a family of 3 per night. And the alternatives to detention are significantly lower. And I do want to be clear that I do think the alternatives to detention are a better method, but it's still not something that I'm a huge fan of because we're treating individuals who are seeking protection like they're criminals with ankle monitors, and other methods need to be explored. And so what are those alternatives to detention? So they're check-ins at the ICE office, home visits, telephonic monitoring, and as I mentioned, the electronic ankle bracelets. And so one method that isn't included here that I do think should be explored more is the community-based alternatives, because there was a pilot program and compliance was just, it was over 90%. So kind of wondering why we don't explore this option more, but it could be because detention is, it's a profit. But hopefully under the Biden administration, now that they're trying to end long-term family detention, we could see some changes, hopefully. So now officially the update. So ICE last reported on February 26th that 13,890 people are currently being detained. They might be under mandatory detention, could be new detainees, not entirely sure. But I also do want to share that ICE facilities in Texas experienced recently much of the same things that other Texans around the state were, no light, water, freezing temperatures. And I'm not sure if you all follow Texas Impact on Facebook, but we did share that the Angry Tias were asking for donations because they had been contacted by people who were being detained, saying that they needed water and they needed commissary funds to purchase water, and also so that they could get blankets and warm pajamas because they were also dealing with that winter storm disaster. Something else, family detention. So as I mentioned a few times, the Biden administration is trying to move away from long-term family detention. They're trying to create these centers or rebrand them into processing centers or rapid processing, so that they're keeping people in detention for a lot less time. Not sure how that's going to play out. Hopefully, we can just continuously move away from detention. But some good news is all the families at the Berks facility have been released. However, the facility does remain open. And so the last thing I want to go over is detention centers for children. So sometimes they're referred to as shelters. These are different from detention centers for adults because they aren't operated by ICE. They're operated by the Office of Refugee Resettlement. Children can be placed into big group settings or more foster care type setting. Sid has also done a lot of extensive research on this. So if he has anything to add, please do, Sid. But let me just go ahead and give you that update on. So facilities for children, some are reopening. The one in Carrizo Springs has been reopened. There's currently 214 children in care. It was all boys. There are reports of the Homestead facility in Florida reopening. Some of you might remember that there was a lot of backlash about this facility being open because there was a lot of reports of abuse that occurred. And lastly, the Biden administration stated that ORR facilities could reopen to their full capacity. And I want to say that this is a result of, and I'll show you the graphs of there's been an increase of unaccompanied children who have been arriving at the border. So I'll go ahead and show you that really quickly. So these are just the encounters. And as I mentioned, kids cannot, unaccompanied children are no longer being expelled under Title 42. So that, there has been an increase at the border. And here are the numbers for the average number of children in care in the US. So you see October 2020, it started gradually increasing. And then at the end of January, there was about 4,000 kids that were in care. And then it jumped a little bit more than 3,000 by the end of February. So there has been an increase at the border for the number of unaccompanied children that are arriving. And so what can you do? So you can join our Courts and Ports program. We're hopefully opening that, I think, within the coming months, safely vaccinated. Contact your local officials, your elected officials. I cannot stress this enough, and not just at the federal level, not just your congressman, not just your US senator, contact your state reps. There are programs that are in the state, so our 287G programs where local law enforcement participate in immigration enforcement with ICE. Those are really problematic programs that are occurring, and those are at the state level and at the local level. So contact your elected officials at all levels. Donate to the organizations and the shelters that are at the border who are responding. I mentioned there's an increase of people that are arriving. When I went to the border, in one of the organizations that was there providing supplies, they were telling me that they had been, for the last few days, they had been receiving about 100 people a day. So this is a lot of supplies that are needed. Volunteer, there's not just at the border, there's other organizations, networks throughout the state. I know there's organizations in Houston that are trying to help out. The IWC is in San Antonio. So definitely reach out to some of the organizations that are in your local community. And lastly, advocate. We need to make sure that we have the, immigration reform so that we're not putting people in detention, and that, we're not putting kids in detention, and so that people can have, access to protection. And I do think we are seeing changes, but we do need to see more. And the last thing that I did want to mention is the number of people that are arriving at the border, it's not entirely unprecedented. We've had large amount of people, large influxes of people arriving at the border, and it has been handled before. This, there's a lot of different moving parts and a lot of different changes. So do understand that, it is going to take some time, but it can be done. But we just need to make sure that it's done in a humane way.